5, things are heating up again over the reappointment of the chairwoman of PURA.
It is the government group that regulates utilities. Text messages between her and one lawmaker are now raising questions.
And your chief political reporter, Susan Raff, is live at the state office complex with the latest. Susan.
Stephanie, as soon as these text messages were made public, there was a lot of talk here in Hartford about the nomination hearing next week for Chairman Marissa Gillette. And in fact, some were saying that it was going to be put on hold. But today, Governor Lamont's communications director says there is no pause and that hearing is still set for next Thursday.
The latest drama is over a few text messages between Chairman Gillette and Representative Jonathan Steinberg, who co-chairs the legislature's Energy Committee. The text messages were made public after a Hartford Courant reporter sent a FOIA request. FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act, which gives the public the right to see government documents. Back in December, Steinberg sent a text to Chairman Gillette saying he sent an overly formal response to her because I'm concerned about being FOIA'd. Some are questioning the relationship between PURA and some state lawmakers, but Representative Steinberg says there's nothing here that backs that up.
It continues the smear campaign against her, and it distracts from what really ought to matter to people when deciding who would be a good commissioner on PURA. This is a distraction. This is perhaps an intentional distraction.
What we are seeing here is a real political battle. This week, Democrats came out swinging, blasting Eversource and Avantgrid, which owns United Illuminating, for waging a campaign to get rid of PURA's chairman. They say she is the first chairman to hold the utilities accountable.
Coming up on Eyewitness News at 6, you'll hear from PURA what their reaction is to this. Also, what do Republicans think about what's going on? And Governor Lamont, is he concerned that his pick, Chairman Marissa Gillette, will she have trouble getting through this process? Your chief political reporter, Susan Raff, Channel 3, live in Hartford tonight.